A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
They've been wrong about the wars. They've been wrong about jobs. They've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show. I'm Matt Wingard, the Horrible Deplorable, and with me, as always, is my good friend Doris. Hello, Doris.
Hello, Matt.
Well, we want to welcome the Gab community. You can find this podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, the405media.com, and disobedientmedia.com. Please write a review if you like this podcast. All we ask is that you find one other person to turn on to being a listener, and we'll grow exponentially that way. So the conversation this week is Charlottesville.
Yes, Charlottesville.
I think we need to first break down what happened and then talk about the media and left reaction to that before we even get to how Trump figures in all of this. So the facts as we know them, and by the way, they're still evolving at this point. We may or may not learn new things about the murderer, the guy who drove, Mr. Fields, who drove the car into the crowd. What the circumstances were behind that and how it all unfolded, I think we're still days and weeks away from finding out about. But what we do know is that a bunch of different groups under the banner of a Unite the Right rally decided to assemble in Charlottesville for a protest against the removal of a Robert E. Lee statue. So that included some people hitched onto that were neo-Nazis and white nationalists, but there were also people who were just conservatives, Southern history supporters, what have you, people who just didn't believe in removing the statues that wanted to come out for that rally. So it was a mix of folks. They had a lawful permit. The city attempted to deny them the ability to lawfully and constitutionally assemble in the park, and a federal judge stepped in and told the city that no, as of today, and this could change next week, but as of today, we still have a Constitution and a First Amendment, and you're going to let these people have their rally. So then Antifa, which for anyone who isn't a mainstream media lackey, basically purposefully pretending that Antifa is some kind of peaceful anti-fascist organization. No one with a brain or who doesn't have an agenda believes that. Antifa, which for the last year and a half has been super violent, ultra violent, wherever they have shown up in full gear with masks. They have broken windows. They have attacked Trump supporters. There are literally dozens and dozens of instances of Trump supporters being attacked by these mobs. They use pepper spray, they throw urine, they apparently do this thing where they bring coolers with bottles or some kind of container filled with cement, in which the cement is then dried, and they toss these things over the crowd line essentially towards their opponents. So this is a very violent, a very sadistic group of folks who have branded themselves as anti-fascists, but they're anything but. And the only people who have bought that line from Antifa is the mainstream media, and I don't actually believe they bought that line. I think they just cover it for them. So Antifa has decided that they're going to show up. Now, they get a legal permit, but they get a legal permit for a different park because the city and the police want to keep these two groups separated. So what happens that day is that Antifa leaves their permitted location and goes to the park where the Unite the Right rally has a legal permit, and they essentially are right on the edge of it chanting. And there are little skirmishes that begin to break out because I suspect Antifa began picking fights with the guards that the Unite the Rally folks had put at the edge of the park to try to keep Antifa-type folks from coming in. Now, it may very well be that people from the Unite the Right rally, who were these guards, instigated the violence. My gut tells me, based on the last year and a half and past behavior, that Antifa instigated the violence in this case. But there will be videos, and there are videos out there that show some of this. It's, when you can never really tell for sure because a video starts at a certain point. You don't know what happened right before that. So the police and the mayor, and I don't know if the Democrat Governor McAuliffe, who's a Clinton crony, I don't know how much he was involved in the decision, but ultimately they make a decision that they're not going to allow the rally to go forward because of these little fights that are happening on the periphery. So they announce to the Unite the Right rally folks that their rally has been canceled and they will not be allowed to hold it, and then they tell them that they expect them to disperse out of the park. So according to the Unite the Right rally folks who were there and the video evidence, the police then did not allow the folks who had assembled for that lawful rally to exit out of the police side of the park, where they could have safely just simply left and gone to their cars or whatever. They forced them to exit out of the park in the direction of where the Antifa line was. And then they actually began to do one of those police push lines where they clear a park and literally pushed all of the Unite the Right rally folks out. So this group included people who were self-confessed neo-Nazis, self-confessed white nationalists, but also, as the president said, other people who did not belong to those groups and had simply come to the rally because they did not want to see the Robert E. Lee statue removed. All of those people were pushed out to Antifa. And what then happened was this major clash of violence in which a lot of people were injured. Eventually, the Unite the Right rally people are basically chased off or beaten or clubbed or what have you. One person had acid thrown in his face, and he's apparently now blind partially. And who knows whether he'll get his sight back. Then the Antifa folks, once they had done that, they just essentially took to the streets of Charlottesville to march in triumph. Again, they had no permit to be outside of the park where they were at, and the Unite the Right rally never actually happened. They had already beaten all of those people, which, by the way, is completely illegal. I think it's violence, and I'm pretty sure that it's still against the law in the United States, but according to the mainstream media and Mitt Romney, that's debatable. But I believe as of that rally, physically assaulting another person is illegal. But anyway, they had done that. The cops had done nothing. I'm sure the people at the Unite the Right rally, at least the neo-Nazi types and the white national types, gave as good as they got, because they came armed with sticks and armor ready to defend themselves because they knew who Antifa was. So this was a melee on both sides at some point, I have no doubt. But the point is that the Unite the Right rally folks dispersed and left the field, if you will, if you consider the city the field. And the Antifa folks began just parading around in triumph and continuing to assault reporters that were trying to cover that activity. And then at some point, this car drives into the crowd and kills one and injures, they say, about 19. Again, we don't know the circumstances of that. We have seen instances in the past where these mobs set upon people in cars, and the cars, either people are dragged out and beaten, or they will plow through the crowd in order to escape and to not be drugged from the crowd. You can go back as far as Reginald Denny during the riots of 1992 in Los Angeles to see countless examples of mobs descending on people in cars who happen to drive up on them and pulling them out. So it is entirely possible that Mr. Fields, well, we know he's a racist because his social media comments and evidence from his parents, apparently, and others have verified that. But what exactly the circumstances were with that crowd, we don't know. And it appears, it's certainly very possible that he purposely murdered those folks. And if so, he's going to face the justice system, and I suspect will face the death penalty or life in prison. I don't think there was ever any doubt on that. I don't think there's even any suspicion that a person who deliberately does that isn't going to face the harshest consequences. But we'll see what the facts of that are as it unfolds in court. Now, let's talk about the media reaction to that. Our absolutely garbage mainstream media immediately reacted to the events that I just described by attributing all the blame to neo-Nazis and white nationalists who were holding a rally. And the arguments varied, but they consisted of that the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists had instigated all the violence, and that the counter-protesters, not Antifa, but the counter-protesters were simply defending themselves. I think a lot of the media is starting to realize there's way too much video evidence to the contrary to support that lie. Then there's this theory that just coming and holding a rally in which you profess repugnant views like neo-Nazis or white nationalists do is justification. That's an incitement to violence, that of course people are going to show up with armor and cement bricks and acid, and they're going to attack those folks and anyone around them because that's just what normal people do.
Normal people do that?
The argument is that if you hold any kind of a rally and someone who's listening finds your arguments or your speech to be repugnant, that's an incitement to violence, and that of course they're going to set upon you with violence. Even Mitt Romney made that argument in his tweets, essentially saying that there was no moral equivalence between the two sides and that one side was there simply to oppose fascism. So that's, as far as I can tell, completely ridiculous. And they began this hoaxing of trying to claim that there had been this massive neo-Nazi rally and that had incited all of this violence in Charlottesville. That is clearly not what happened. The other thing they did, which was a neat little trick, was to ascribe to everyone at the rally what one person did in a car in plowing down those folks in Charlottesville. Now, when one man shows up at a park in Virginia and shoots a bunch of Republican congressmen, including Steve Scalise, that is just the work of one madman. Even though he was a Bernie supporter and he had a social media account in which he had said all sorts of things, that's just the work. It's just a mental health issue, and it's the work of a madman. Now, Mr. Fields looks like he's also a mental health issue, but because he's a useful idiot, essentially, for the left and for the mainstream media, who have been desperate to fixate on some kind of right-on-left violence, he's become the poster child for all of that. Now, again, let's back up. Over the last year and a half, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of instances of people on the left violently attacking Trump supporters or people on the right. It has happened so often that it's ridiculous to even claim that it hasn't. Now, the media has tried to ignore it. About half the time they ignore it. The other half of the time they will report it, but then they quickly move on. And the story, the truth of the last year and a half is that the violence has really been one direction, from the left to the right. Conservative speakers at college campuses, that has created riots in which property is damaged, people are assaulted. I saw a video of one guy being hit with a bike lock by an Antifa. They could have killed him, could have absolutely brained him. And it's very, very fortunate that they did not. And that man has been arrested. He was an associate professor at the university and lost his job. But I mean, these are not, most of these people who are the self-confessed, they're getting fired now because they're being doxxed on the media and they're losing their jobs. And their jobs were, one guy worked at a pizza joint, another one of these white nationalists worked at a hot dog stand. Yeah, this is really the most dangerous group of people in America. It's a bunch of white guys that have low-level jobs at, hot dog stands and pizzerias. They're not a threat to anyone. But these Antifa people, we've identified one who got arrested for hitting somebody with a bike lock in the head. He was an associate professor at a university. That's not a hot dog stand or a pizzeria. Those are elite jobs. And the fact of the matter is there's plenty of evidence that people who are participating in these Antifa violent excursions are not hot dog stand workers and pizzeria. Everybody's claiming there's no equivalence between the two. I would agree. The power differential between these two groups, as far as I can tell, the people who are the self-confessed neo-Nazis and white nationalists who showed up have absolutely no power in this country. It's a couple of dozen people who essentially have minimum wage jobs. The people who are showing up and doing the violence from Antifa's side are, we know in one case, an associate professor at a university. And most of them wear masks, so we don't know who the rest of them are. But we do know that the mainstream media believes they're angels. The New Yorker did a cartoon in which they showed Trump with an angel on one side and a Nazi on the other side, the devil, saying, you gotta listen to both sides. As if to suggest that Antifa were the angels in this scenario. I mean, that's just a lie. And the Antifa has power, and they have power not just because of who their membership may or may not be, but because of look at the way the elites are reacting. The elites are backing up Antifa. So I would argue that you had basically two thuggish groups there battling it out in Charlottesville. But interestingly, the one part where I kind of disagree with the president on is that they're really not equal, because one side has the full power and sanction of America's elites behind it. And that is quite a thing. When you're a street gang that is doing intimidation and fomenting violence, when you have the backing of America's elites, that makes you quite dangerous, but not only quite powerful, but quite dangerous. And as long as we're going to make comparisons to the KKK, which the Democrat Party created 150 years ago, by the way, they were effective for many years because they had the backing and the sanction of their society's elites. They weren't just a couple of, low-wage thugs on horseback intimidating minorities like blacks and Catholics. They were sanctioned at the highest levels and excused. And what people at the highest levels of society in the South were doing was downplaying the violence that they were committing, denying the violence that they were committing, and excusing as justified the violence that they were committing. I'm talking about the Klan, but if that sounds exactly like what's going on with Antifa today, I intend for that comparison to be made. So Trump comes out in all of this hoaxing and lying because the media finally has a murder that's been committed that they can roughly define as right on left, even though, by the way, we could talk at length about how Nazis are the National Socialist Party and that Nazism is a socialist outcrop and that communists and Nazis are essentially two sides of the same coin. But that aside, there is a sort of false belief among the general public that somehow Nazis are on the right. And for their purposes, that serves the purposes of the media to make this case that it's right on left violence. Even though it's not, even if we grant that, okay, you have an instance here of right on left violence, it is absolutely not equivalent to the pile of violence that's been going on the other side, which the media ignores and excuses. So Trump comes out in the wake of Charlottesville and says the truth. He says there's violence going on both sides, and this needs to stop. He condemns white nationalists and Nazis on the second day because there's this tremendous pressure from the media that he has to name them specifically. But he maintains correctly that there's violence on both sides. And then he makes this point that there were good people on both sides drawn into that. And what he meant, and he very clearly stated, because in that same sentence he denounced white nationalists and Nazis, but he was talking about those people who came to the rally who just didn't want to see the Robert E. Lee statue removed and did not identify as white nationalists and did not identify as neo-Nazis. And they didn't even have a chance to reject those opinions because the rally never took place. So we never actually heard from anybody at the rally. And Trump's argument was that there were very probably leftists who came to counter-protest that rally who were not part of Antifa and did not want to engage in violent melee with people. So both sides had peaceful folks who basically probably just wanted to state their views and to say unkind things about the other side. And both sides had thugs in armor who came and participated in a melee. Trump spoke the truth. And as we've seen over the last year and a half, because starting with the point about Mexico not sending their best across the border and that there are rapists and that there's all sorts of violent crime going on the part of illegal aliens on Americans, Trump has consistently spoken the truth, moved the Overton window, refused to stay within the lying frame of the mainstream media and to just say, no, this is what's actually going on. This is the truth. And he did it on his very first day when he announced his candidacy for president, and he did it this weekend. He just refuses to go along with these conventional wisdoms or these little white lies or these manufactured left lies that are part of the narrative. He just won't do that. He simply states the truth. And for that, he gets called a Nazi and being sympathetic to white nationalists, even though he's completely condemned them repeatedly. It won't matter how many times he condemns them. And David Duke comes out, or Richard Spencer, one of them, and thanks the presidents for his remarks. And of course, that travels all over social media, and the press picks that up because, of course, the fact that they say something nice about the president or thank him, what's Trump to do about that, right? I mean, he's already denounced them. He doesn't want their support. There's nothing he can do about them praising him. When David Duke comes out and endorses Keith Ellison for chairman of the Democrat National Party, which he did earlier in the last year, that was not something the mainstream media picked up and tied to Keith Ellison and said that he had to denounce, or that somehow permanently tainted Keith Ellison because David Duke had endorsed him for chair of the Democrat Party. So it's a one-way game, rules for thee, but not for me, that the left and their consorts in the media play. And you just simply have to reject this game. I realize that most people listening to this probably have. Yet you have to turn it off. And Fox News is barely better. But we all know that we all have friends and family that are listening to this stuff. They are just drinking in this toxic poison that the left and their media acolytes pour into them on a daily basis.
What I don't understand is the position the policemen took. I mean, we're supposed to be proud of our policemen and think they're doing a good job. But had they not sent them the wrong direction into the crowd of Antifa, there would not have been near the violence, and perhaps that person wouldn't have been killed.
Yeah, there's going to be an investigation in all this, and the findings will be interesting. I suspect that there's a lot of frustration in the police. You know, they get an order to stand down. If that's what happened from the mayor, there's not a lot that they can do about that. They have to be organized and very kind of official in what they do. Individual policemen cannot kind of break from the line and go into the melee and say, you know, I'm just going to do my job, because likely they'll be set upon and they won't be safe. Police have a very methodical way that they handle crowd control, and if they're not under orders and if they're not doing that in a methodical way, it could unravel very quickly.
So what happens is politics comes into play on what the police are told by their superiors.
Of course, there's a really interesting video that traveled around on social media that's about a minute and a half, and it's this young man. He's probably a minimum wage earner who's in a Confederate uniform and has a Confederate flag on a pole, and he clearly is an admirer of General Lee, and he showed up at the statue to, I think he was just standing there, or he was saluting. He wasn't Nazi saluting. He was just I think he was just standing there, if I remember from the image. He's just standing there quietly next to the General Lee statue. And these counter-protesters, I don't know whether they were Antifa or not, they didn't actually physically assault him, but they surrounded him within like a foot. And they were all yelling racist, Nazi, words like that in his face. And he was quite serene, just standing there with his Confederate flag looking at the Robert E. Lee statue. And it looked, as it went on, like they were not satisfied that they weren't getting a reaction out of him and that it might get violent. And a police officer steps in and tells him that he's going to escort him to his car. And in the video, he gets escorted to the police car. And the policeman this young man never shows any reaction of any kind. The officer puts him in the car. And by the way, this crowd of like 5 or 6 people follows this whole event, and they continue just to constantly yell out racist, Nazi pig, all sorts of horrible, horrible words. I'm sure lots of cuss words too. And the cop is just doing his business and puts this guy in the squad car, shuts the door, and this young woman is still yelling profanities. And the cop very serenely turns to her, and he says, this is all on the video, he just turns to her and he says, "You want another Charlottesville, don't you?" And then the video ends. And I thought, it was a very good moment in sort of showing you that frustration that I think a lot of police have, that they have been dealing with Antifa in various cities for a year and a half. They know exactly who these thugs are. No one understands how much lying the media is doing than the police in these various cities who've had to deal with Antifa. And there's probably 24 cities now in which the police have kind of regular contact with Antifa, and they know them for the violent thugs that they are. So in that one moment, you get that sense that cop understands exactly what's going on and that he's just as frustrated. And he doesn't probably support that young man in the Confederate uniform or care for his views at all. But that young man's not a threat to anyone. And the argument that Mitt Romney and other people are making, sadly for them, because I just find what Mitt Romney is doing to trash the Constitution to be abhorrent. But the argument they're making is that to simply be a fan of the Confederacy or to hold white nationalist views that many people would argue are racist, although a lot of people would argue that Black Lives Matter's views are oftentimes very racist. But the point is that certain views are so repugnant that they will automatically incite violence, that people cannot help themselves. Now, this defense, by the way, feminists reject this idea that men can't help themselves in a rape trial, right? And that in any other context, the idea that human beings can't help themselves is basically rejected by the left. But here, and again, to show you, we've talked about this in previous podcasts, the 180-degree tactics of the left, right? There's no argument they won't make today and then turn around and make the opposite argument tomorrow, because the arguments don't matter. It is constantly about pushing for power and winning. So if you're looking for consistency from them, you'll wait until your beard reaches the ground. But in this case, and stupid people like Romney fell for it, the argument is that somehow this particular kind of hate speech will just automatically incite violence. So there was an op-ed published in the New York Times today. It's not an op-ed under the editors' names, but a guest op-ed. But I'm still dumbfounded that this was published in the New York Times. And it's a warning, folks, of where things are going, because usually these things are trial balloons from the New York Times, and people tend to dismiss these things and say, oh, that's just one person's opinion. But if you go back and look at the New York Times, when they published very outlandish editorials, 10 years later, it's become the norm. So the New York Times is sort of testing the waters to begin the movement. And what did this op-ed say? It was taking on and criticizing the ACLU for defending and going to court to make sure that rally, the Unite the Right rally, went forward. The ACLU has gone very left on a lot of issues. They've essentially abandoned every aspect of the Constitution except for the First Amendment, which is how they were originally created. They've stayed very true to their core of defending everyone's right to free speech and to assembly. They've abandoned politically every other element of the Constitution. But I think they're actually under enough pressure that you will watch the ACLU walk away from their core tenet in the next decade. But anyway, the ACLU had defended the right of these folks to peaceably assemble. They defended the Klan's ability to march 50 years ago. They've always done this because they believe, at least for now, that there's a universal free speech right, and that if any speech can be curtailed and pushed off the public square, that ultimately then your own speech will be in jeopardy eventually. And they are correct about that. So this woman professor writes this op-ed saying, taking the ACL to task and saying that basically some speech isn't okay. And she reminds the ACLU that they've taken an expansive view of the Constitution on a whole bunch of other issues, and that it's time for them to take that view on the First Amendment. And her argument was cold but clear, that certain people should not have free speech rights in the United States.
Really? That's what it said?
That's what it said.
Wow.
And I invite you all who probably want nothing to do with the New York Times, go and find the article and read it and pass it around, because it's really important that people see what the New York Times published today, because that will be the agenda going forward. And frankly, what I've seen in the last few days has not been very heartening, especially from people like Mitt Romney, as far as supporting the First Amendment. So the takeaways from Charlottesville, right? That violence is acceptable if it's coming from the left. What we're seeing and what we've seen in the reaction from the mainstream media and folks is a fundamental rejection of the First Amendment. This has nothing to do with a bunch of minimum wage earners who identify as white nationalists or neo-Nazis. It has nothing to do with them. Because if the First Amendment, if we can get collective agreement that the First Amendment allows them to be pushed off of the public square, they will not be the last ones. And a case in point, look at the monuments that are coming down. I know a lot of people out there don't necessarily care that much about Confederate monuments, but the calls for Jefferson and Washington have already gone up. The calls to bring down the monuments to Teddy Roosevelt have already gone up. So as these Confederate monuments come down, if you think those are the last monuments to America's past that are going to come down, if you think the Founding Fathers, some of whom were slaveholders, aren't going to be targeted, I love it when I hear the left react in the last couple of days of, oh, poo-poo, that's just a silly argument to say that Jefferson and Washington will be next. Over the last 30 years, as the left has gained in every aspect of the social sphere, every time somebody has said, well, this will lead to X, and the left has laughed it off, we've watched it lead to X, haven't we?
Yes, we have.
Time and again, They've rejected the slippery slope argument, and it has done just exactly that. One thing has led to another, and they know it, and they actually do want those things, and they know they're lying. I'm telling you right out, I'm old enough, and I've watched this play out, that when the left says, oh, no one's calling for Washington and Jefferson, they're lying. They actually do plan to call for Washington and Jefferson. They just know they need to wait a certain amount of time before they begin to do that. They want to consolidate their wins around the Confederate monuments, and once they have done that and set a precedence, they will simply then methodically turn on their next target. It will happen like clockwork. So according to the left, people are divided into classes. There are those in a certain class who have a right to say things that other people think are despicable. And then there are those in another class who don't have a right to say things that other people think are despicable, and who will be met with violence if they do it, and it will be sanctioned, or the violence will be said to be the fault of the people who were exercising their free speech rights. I want you to imagine what the narrative would have been if people had shown up at a Black Lives Matter rally where they were chanting things like F the pigs and pigs in a blanket, what do we want? We want pigs dead. And then a violent group in masks had shown up and beaten them from the field. What would the narrative be? Would it be that it was Black Lives Matter's fault, that they were calling for the execution of policemen? And of course, that's repugnant. And so, of course, people are going to show up in mass. They may or may not be families of the policemen or supporters of the police, and they're going to show up and they're going to violently attack you because that's just what happens. Would that argument have ever been made?
No.
This is a dark chapter, the last 4 or 5 days. Now, the left is hoaxing and trying to claim that somehow what Donald Trump said is the dark chapter. And I am a firm believer in this idea of projection, that almost always, without fail, when the left is hyperventilating about something, it's something that they are guilty of. And that what they're doing is trying to throw off the hysteria onto some other scapegoat so that we don't actually look at what they're doing. Almost always when they're, for instance, when they're claiming that there's a real problem with fascism in this country. Well, there actually is a problem with fascism in this country. It's Antifa. The people acting like fascists are Antifa. So this, you can find this projection all over. If they get all hysterical and claim some Republican is doing X, it's probably them that's doing it, and that's why it's just this automatic thing to try to get it away from them and throw their sins onto someone else. And so this whole hoax over the last 4 or 5 days that Donald Trump has done something repugnant is actually projection. What's happened over the last 4 to 5 days is that the left and Democrats and never-Trumpers and the media have done something very repugnant. They have soiled and injured the First Amendment of the United States. Now, whether that injury is permanent, time will tell. We'll know over the next couple of weeks whether there's a kind of a counter response and a bounce back to reestablish the 250-year norms of what the First Amendment defends, or whether this cancer on the First Amendment coalesces in the next few weeks and becomes accepted elite conventional wisdom that we need a new definition of the First Amendment that cuts certain people out. We'll find out. I want to stay on this for a second and ask this question about who's using Nazi tactics. So I'm a firm believer in this political phrase that's gone around for years, that the first person to yell Nazi in an argument loses. I just think that there's very seldom any real comparison to Nazi Germany and the history of Germany and the rise of the Nazi Party. It's just an entirely different history. It's not connected to the United States in any way, shape, or form. But the left has decided to claim that the country is overrun with Nazis, and that anybody who even defends the free speech rights of Nazis, or who doesn't essentially back Antifa, go along with the lie that they're not violent. If you do any of these things to dissent from this false narrative, you yourself are a Nazi. So Nazis, everywhere Nazis. I do want to then just ask this question, though. What exactly, if you boil it down, if you try to sort of take the historical context out and boil down the Nazi movement in Germany to its essence, what were the sort of universal tactics that the Nazis were using? Let's talk about the 3 or 4 things that defined that movement and see if you can identify where that might be repeating itself. So the first thing the Nazis did was that they found themselves a scapegoat. And they identified that scapegoat based on the group's genetics. They found a genetic group, something that then that group and people in that group could do nothing to change because you can't change your genetics. They identified a group by their genetics that were the cause of every bad thing that was happening in society. They essentially were the cause belli. They were the source of all of the evil. Everything that was going on around. The line essentially was that if your life isn't going well, if things aren't working out for you, it's the scapegoat's fault. That was their argument. Now, do you hear that going on in this country? I do. I hear the line that straight white males are the source of all evil in this country. They're apparently the source of the whole rape culture that exists in the United States. They're the source of all this white supremacy and white privilege. They have this white privilege. You know, the Nazis made an argument that the Jews in Germany had Jewish privilege. That was essentially, they didn't use those words, but that was essentially their argument, was that the Jews, their scapegoat, had privilege in society and that they needed to be extracted. Well, there's only one thing that even remotely looks like that in the United States, and it's this argument that there's this white privilege and that white men and this whole concept of white privilege has to be extracted from society, that they have to be pulled down so that others can flourish. The argument is there. It's made on a daily basis. Okay, what was another thing that the Nazis did? They essentially, remember that Germany was a very young country. It had come together as a country in basically the mid-1800s and was experimenting with democracy in the wake of World War I. And the Nazi argument to this new democracy was that it was tainted, that the whole idea of democracy was tainted by the scapegoat, the genetic group that couldn't change genetics, that they were involved. This scapegoat was involved in founding and running this democracy, and therefore the democracy and the idea of democracy was tainted. This blood libel, essentially. That is the argument behind the founding fathers were a bunch of racist slaveholders, and the Constitution has to be rejected because it was created by a bunch of white men who had white privilege. That's the argument you hear out there from the left. Essentially, all of our constitutional norms, all of the freedoms and things that we fundamentally believe in, they're all tainted. And that's why we have to have this expansive and new definition of the Constitution. And we have to remake this society because the people who founded it are all tainted. And there you have it. Okay, the other thing the Nazis had was they had this tactic of employing brown shirts. So they had young people who they encouraged to be violent and to take to the streets to intimidate their opponents. Now, again, that they were socialists, so most of their opponents were communists. So they wanted the communists off the street. But then they set upon just the regular, anybody who defended democracy or who stood up against the Nazis, the brown shirts would intimidate them. Now, they would start by surrounding them and shouting at them. And then eventually, if that didn't drive the person from the street corner, they would bludgeon them until they left. Who's doing that in America today?
Antifa.
And again, as I said earlier, I would make the argument that we've always had, a group of people who might show up and be thugs. We've had very few instances where violent thugs have been sanctioned at the highest levels. The Klan was certainly an example of that in American history. The Democrats. And now, once again, we have an instance of violent thugs taking to the streets to intimidate their political opponents or anybody that they think disagrees with them, including just journalists that are filming them. I mean, this has happened repeatedly where they just beat journalists for filming them. And by the way, the brown shirts in Germany did that. They beat all sorts of foreign correspondents who were trying to report on what was going on. But the Antifa is sanctioned at the highest levels. You see it from the elite media, right? So there is a real comparison there. Violent thugs, that's sort of every society deals with that, people who take to sticks to beat their opponents. But to actually be sanctioned at the highest levels, that's a very rare commodity, and we see that with Antifa. But certainly the brown shirts in Nazi Germany were sanctioned at the highest levels. So I would make the argument that you should never even bring up the Nazis. But if the left insists on making this comparison, I think the evidence is overwhelming that the Nazi tactics are being perpetrated on their side.
Exactly.
So on Trump's press conference, which was glorious, and if you haven't actually sat down and watched Trump's press conference with the media in Trump Tower, I invite you all to do it. This man is a fighter. And I think one of the things we're all realizing as we watch him fight for us and for truth and for the Constitution is that so many of the people we've been electing for decades were never going to do that. Look at the reaction of the GOP as Trump has tried to tell the truth about what happened in Charlottesville. It breaks down basically into a couple of categories. You have all the never-Trumpers who just are so mad at Trump, and those of us who support him, that they believe that the next scandal that they create is going to be the thing that's going to break him and bring him down. And so they get hysterical and they jump on the liberal mainstream media bandwagon because they've lost all their power, and they think that this Trump phenomenon is just some fever that we all have that's going to break at some moment, and that the Bill Kristols of the world are all going to somehow be asked to come back and be elite leaders of our party. They're out. They're permanently out, and they're never coming back. And that has created a hysterical frustration on their part, and that's why they jump on all these bandwagons as they go by. But you also see a lot of GOP elected officials who just immediately, I think they know the narrative is false. I think they knew from the first day it was false, but they are so afraid. I think they also understand that Trump's a fighter in a way that they aren't. They know that he just fights until he gets back up on top of the pile. And I think they do self-assessments in these moments, and they understand that they don't have that kind of courage or strength, that they don't believe that they can withstand the withering arrows from the mainstream media for a few days until they fight their way back on top of the pile. And so they cave right at the beginning. I mean, they are all surrender monkeys, immediately willing to parrot the lies from the media in order to save themselves. They just, basically, they see a mob running towards them, and they immediately change out of their uniform into civilian clothes and stand off to the side and say, yeah, I'm not with that group. Don't come for me. They are gutless. They are absolutely gutless, and so many of them need to go. And we just have to start taking them out.
They don't have the courage of their convictions, and maybe that's because they don't have any convictions.
I think it's just about power and being a Republican and getting called congressman or senator. They've been selling us out, and one of the great gifts that Trump gave us was to expose them for the weak, cowardly charlatans that they are. Most of us who love Trump understand that if he had not come along, we would still be to some degree or another ignorant of just what duplicitous clowns so many of our own elected officials are, that they were never, ever going to fight to win. They were never going to deliver victories, ever. It was never going to happen. And that's why they have to go. They have to go. So in the wake of all of this, though, I don't want any of you to lose heart. Trump is winning. He will win on this. He will be reelected in 2020. We will drive many of these never Trump idiots out of the party. Don't worry about that. But I did warn you, and I've repeatedly warned you in this podcast, that it would get worse. That it has to get worse before it gets better, because the left is never going to compromise with us. And so they are only going to get more and more hysterical. Again, that comparison to the spoiled child that you suddenly decide to start disciplining. He's going to reject your discipline at first, and he's going to assume that there's some breaking point. You used to cave to him. And so as you discipline him, he's going to assume that I can get this reversed. I can get my parent to give me what I want. Now, my parent used to break after a minute. Now, of course, it's taking 2 or 3 minutes, but I know there's a breaking point at which I can get my parent to give in. And and if you wait 5 minutes, the child will assume that they just need to go to 6. And if you wait 10 minutes, the child will assume they just need to go to 11. It is a difficult task. Ask anybody who's actually tried to discipline a spoiled child. It is a difficult task. And we're facing the same thing with the hysterical left. They are going to keep ratcheting up the pain and discomfort until they reach what they think will be our breaking point. And you can see it from the Mitt Romneys of the world. They're already running out the white flag saying, yeah, I don't want to go any further than this. Let's just let the left have their way. I mean, if that means the First Amendment has to go away, I just want peace and tranquility in my society, as he puts the perfumed hanky to his face. They will never fight for us. They're not going to do it, and Trump is. Those of you who are hoping to find middle ground with them, good luck. It doesn't exist because the left won't allow it. If you need something to energize you, I want you to spend a moment thinking about what will happen if these folks that we're watching on the left who are hysterical, and we've been watching them now for a year, become more and more unhinged and more hysterical. Ask yourself what's going to happen when these people get back in power, if we ever allow it.
Scary.
Now, they have denied a peaceful transition of power to Trump, but they fully expect that when their next president is elected, that we will allow a peaceful transition of power. I don't know whether that is going to happen. I mean, once you break down the norms, but of course, they've played this game for a long time where they've assumed that they can break the norms and that when we're elected, we'll go back to restoring the norms so that they can then break them. They are sort of that child that acts out but knows there's a parent there to rescue them. They've always acted that way and won victory after victory on that assumption. I don't know whether they can count on it, but you better focus your mind on who these people are and what you're seeing, because these hysterical people that you're watching, these lying journalists that you're seeing every day, what's it going to be like if they actually get back into power? They're going to hunt down and persecute everyone in the public sphere who supported Trump. Think very carefully about your commitment level monetarily and in your time and energy to this movement, because we've kicked a hornet's nest. The globalists, the leftists, the entire liberal commanding heights is seething, and it will not rest until they have reacquired power. You and I, we will decide if this is just another pause in the red march of the left to fundamentally transform America. We will decide that if we ever allow them back into power. So John Kasich announced, or he hinted, he let it leak out, that he is thinking about challenging Trump in 2020. And I could not stop smiling. The idea of defeating John Kasich in the Republican primary is so delicious. It's such a glorious thought. The absolute highlight of that will be when John Kasich loses his home state of Ohio to President Donald Trump in that Republican primary. So I say, John, go for it. Bring it on. Let's have that primary fight. Nothing will make me happier. And again, it puts all the never-Trumpers in one camp. It re-identifies, again, for us, all of the people who have no intention of fighting to win and fighting on the principles to actually defeat the left. They won't do it. Once again, the GOP has shown us who they are. They won't push back against liberal narratives, and their hatred and jealousy of Trump is all that they can see. Normally, politicians respect any successful politician, but they don't like Trump. Why? Even though he's been successful. This is about the issues that Trump stands for. Notice that yesterday, it didn't get a lot of reporting, but the U.S. trade rep that Trump has appointed began the negotiations over NAFTA, the renegotiations of NAFTA. That was a huge story this week. Now, also, a whole bunch of CEOs quit Trump's business councils, and they all claimed that it was over his comments around Charlottesville. Don't you believe it? Don't you believe it? Those CEOs quit because they can see where the NAFTA negotiations are going. Trump is absolutely intent in reestablishing what he said, bringing manufacturing back and stop allowing these trade agreements to be so imbalanced. Most of these corporations benefit from the way that NAFTA is currently set up, and they do not like where this is headed. So Charlottesville was just an excuse, just cover for them to walk away. Trump's America First nationalism threatens nearly every sacred cow in D.C. These folks are not going to stop. So Doris and I were talking the other day about the 200-year movement to expand the franchise, and I made the argument that there was a fatal flaw behind that movement. And she asked me to explain, so I will. So I got to take you back to the original Constitutional Convention. There was a split in the room among people who believed that this was scary, this idea of a federal government that would have this kind of power, and they were inclined to oppose it. And Madison ended up in a conversation with them in which he said, I want to hear your concerns. And they outlined their concerns about what protections they believed needed to be in the Constitution. And those, by the way, became the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. Well, Madison believed that was already implicit in the Constitution. He thought that those things were already protected. So his argument was, when they suggested we want the first 10 amendments to be enacted on the very first day that the first Congress meets, we want these Bill of Rights to be passed. And Madison's response was, well, since I already think it's implicit in the Constitution, I have absolutely no problem articulating it specifically. So he said, sure, if that's what it takes to get this passed, we'll do it. And they had a handshake deal, and there was trust. And what happened then was the Constitution was ratified, and the federal government was created, but there was no Bill of Rights. Those states voted to ratify the Constitution without the Bill of Rights, but everybody understood there was an explicit understanding that that would be the first action. And then the Congress met, and the very first thing they did was pass the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which we now call the Bill of Rights. So I tell you that story because there was this understanding that there is this balance. Think of this scale, this delicate balance built into so many aspects of the Constitution. Both the House and the Senate is a balance based on states versus proportional representation. There's a balance between the judiciary and the executive and the legislative branch. There are all sorts of balances of power built into the Constitution. And my argument is that it is perfectly okay to amend the Constitution, but the people who are involved in that activity have to be aware that they are messing with a delicately balanced scale, and that they need to make sure that they are putting a counterbalance on to offset whatever it is that they're about to do. And that, I believe, is the fatal flaw in the expansion of the franchise that occurred over the 5-year history of our country. We started out with only white landowners being able to have a vote. And then by the time of Andrew Jackson, you get an expansion of the full franchise to all adult men. And then after the Civil War, you get the freedom of the slaves and the rights of everyone to vote, all males to vote. It isn't exactly totally enforced, obviously, until the civil rights movement of the 60s. And then with the 19th Amendment in 1920, you get the expansion to women. It says basically all adults. So we have this slow and steady progress of expanding the franchise, which I'm not opposed to. But my argument is that each expansion of the franchise should have been met with a counterbalancing libertarian amendment. What the founders worried about was this sort of mob, the idea that the entire populace, who for the most part are not landowners, would become this sort of unruly democratic mob, which is what the ancient societies had dealt with and had brought them down, was this unruly mob. And so they had limited the franchise. And I don't think there's anything wrong with coming back in and saying, well, we want to expand the franchise. But just as those folks who were originally opposed to the Constitution argued, they said, look, you need to articulate specifically some of our rights in order for us to give this power to the federal government. And what should have happened in the discussions as the franchise was expanded was there should have been a counter argument of, okay, if we're going to expand the franchise, we need to also add to the Bill of Rights some kind of a libertarian amendment that further specifically articulates the rights of the individual, so that as we are creating more of a mob because we are basically enfranchising everyone, we are protecting the individual even more specifically. And I would argue that, for instance, one amendment should have been a specific articulation of a person's property rights.
Yes.
That's thought to be implicit in the Constitution, but as we've seen, once people begin to make clever arguments for expanding the definition of the Constitution, they can simply pretend that that's not there. Look at the attacks on the Second Amendment. Because the language is so explicit about the right to bear arms, it has been very difficult for opponents to talk or argue around that. And that was the purpose of the Bill of Rights, was to say things explicitly so that some clever lawyer 100 years later couldn't talk around it. And what didn't happen as we expanded the franchise is we did not add more explicit amendments to the Constitution, expanding the Bill of Rights, to specifically detail what the rights of the individual were, to create that counterbalance from this growing body of voters that could, over time, begin to act like a mob. And I think to the extent that we have seen the Constitution trashed and shredded, and to the extent that we've seen individual rights eroded, it is both caused by the expansion of the franchise, but also by the failure to counterbalance that expansion with specifically articulated individual rights that would keep the mob at bay. So that was my argument to Doris, was that I just feel like that, again, I'm not opposed to expanding the franchise. I think that was probably inevitable, and it had to happen. But the failure on the part of our ancestors, if you were, our legislative ancestors, our elected officials who are now long gone, is that they didn't take that job more seriously. When they were sitting down to craft those amendments to expand the franchise, they didn't think about what the counterbalance needed to be. There seemed to be just this push to expand one element of the Constitution without keeping in mind that they'd been handed something that was extremely delicately balanced, and that if you're going to tinker with it, you need to make sure you're putting weights on the various sides of the scale and not just on one side. So Doris and I saw a couple of movies. We actually went to the theater to watch a Bonnie and Clyde, what was it, 50th anniversary?
Yeah, 50th anniversary. You know, I hadn't seen Bonnie and Clyde when it came out, and I think I would have been more shocked then than now about violence in the movie. Up to then had been bloodless, but people died, but they didn't really suffer. You didn't see them suffering. So this was the definitive film of the 60s. America was getting more violent. The Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, mass murders, riots, and it ended up that Bonnie and Clyde became rebel icons for the youth movement.
So this movie stars Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, made in 1967. So what did you think? I mean, it has this sort of historical context, and a lot of critics like it for that. But what did you personally just think of? I mean, you didn't see it in the 60s. So, Doris, you're watching it in 2017 for the first time. And in that context, then the movie really has to stand on its own merits because it has no historical context. What did you think?
I thought it showed a realism of how a gangster really was instead of the Hollywood-type virtuous kind of gangster that we have had.
It was an early anti-hero, wasn't it?
Yes,
because
it was.
He was somewhat sympathetic and you kind of cared what was happening to them, but they weren't really good people, and that was very obvious.
Yeah, so you didn't mind at the end when they died.
I certainly didn't. I'm not a huge fan of the movie. I do appreciate its value. I mean, I sort of separate classics into two categories. Those that have, in their time and place, they were important, so they have sort of historical context, either for the culture or for movie-making history, and those movies are important and they're classics for that reason. And then there are movies that I think just transcend. They, like The Wizard of Oz. It doesn't even really matter that that movie was made in 1939. That movie still delights children today. So it exists outside of its context. It's a classic in its own right. And a lot of critics would put Bonnie and Clyde in the category of classics in its own right. I wouldn't. I think it's more of a historically important movie, but I think it's been done better since. A lot of the same themes have been done better since in other movies. And it's not a bad movie. It's certainly watchable, and it's got some good moments, but I wouldn't put it on a, really select list of timeless classics.
Well, actually, it was better, though, than the other movie we saw, which was The Barefoot Contessa.
Now, we watched that on TV. We didn't go to the theater on that one. That's 1954, starring Humphrey Bogart and Ava Gardner.
Bogart did this role just 3 years before he died. He plays a washed-up film director who gets a second chance at stardom when he discovers this stunningly beautiful Ava Gardner, who is a dancer. So The Barefoot Contessa is about the rise of a movie goddess who is looking for love, but all she finds is men who want to use her and own her. It was beautifully and vividly filmed and reminded me that beauty and fame do not always equal happiness.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't recommend this film. I think the themes have been dealt with in other films better and more successfully. I don't think it was that great a film even when it came out. But, of course, I love Humphrey Bogart. And if you do love either Humphrey Bogart or Ava Gardner, of course you have to see the movie because they're both wonderful in it. I was delighted by the fact that the director threw in this moment where Humphrey Bogart has a trench coat and a hat on and is running in the rain. It was totally unnecessary, but it's such an iconic Humphrey Bogart thing that he found a way to give Humphrey Bogart this moment to be Humphrey Bogart, which I thought was just great.
Yeah, that was great.
Okay, so we're just about out of time. You can find this podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Pocket Casts, and I hope that you will find a friend and turn them on to this podcast so that we can grow our audience. This is a labor of love, but we do need to grow. You are not alone. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.